Good afternoon. Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to AEI. My name is Meredith Schultz, and I work with the Values in Capitalism program here at AEI. If you've not joined us before, Values in Capitalism is an outreach of the Institute that seeks to make the moral case for free enterprise on college campuses around the country. Today, our event is surrounding Mike McShane's latest book, Education and Opportunity, right here, which is the 15th and latest edition in our series of mini books, which are a series of public policy primers geared toward college students on a variety of different topics, from wealth and justice, the impact of changing family structures, to economic growth. If you haven't grabbed a copy of this great new book yet, you can do so out in the lobby. If you're live tweeting or joining us by live stream today, you can tweet at us using the hashtag EDOP2014. That's EDOPP 2014. So I'd love to introduce our panelists here today. I'll start with Mike McShane here on the far side. Mike is a research fellow in education policy studies here at AEI. He's the co-editor with Rick Hess of Common Core Meets Education Reform and the co-author of President Obama and Education Reform, The Personal and the Political. His analyses have been published widely in technical journals and reports, including Education, Finance, and Policy, and he's also contributed to a number of popular publications, such as Education Next, the Huffington Post, National Review, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Mike began his career as an inner-city high school teacher in Alabama. Next, here is Jeffrey Bailey, who's joining us all the way from Atlanta, Georgia. He's the executive vice president at Arete Scholars Fund, which is a tax credit scholarship fund providing low-income K-12 students with access to greater educational opportunities in Georgia and also in Louisiana. He has served as the director of the Center for an Educated Georgia, and before moving to the U.S. 2 years ago as managing director of the Center for Social Justice, which is a political think tank in London. Prior to that time, he taught at the University of Cambridge and published in various academic books and journals. Most recently, he authored Rethinking Integration, which is a forthcoming report on social mobility among ethnic minorities in Britain, with a particular emphasis on the role of education. And finally, Andy Smerek, who's here in DC, local, is a partner in Bellwether Education Partners Policy and Thought Leadership Practice. He's also served as New Jersey's Deputy Commissioner of Education, as Deputy Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Education and White House Domestic Policy Council, and has also worked for Congress and the Maryland State Legislature. Other roles include visiting fellow at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, a former adjunct fellow at AEI, welcome home, and co-founder and chief operational officer of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. Andy has also helped to launch a college preparatory charter school for underserved students and is widely published in the nation's leading newspapers and journals. Without further ado, please welcome our panel, and I'll kick it off with Mike.
Okay, thank you, Meredith. There's that old saying, there's no such thing as a free lunch. So we might have to add to that today, there's also no such thing as a free book, because y'all got both a free book and a free lunch, but as a consequence, you have to listen to me talk now. So thank you all for being here. Appreciate having you. So, and thanks to the Values in Capitalism team who asked me to join the august lineup of people who've contributed to their public policy series. Everything from Charles Murray, who wrote about the Constitution, our president, Arthur Brooks, Christina Hoff Sommers, a whole lot of folks that have joined this. So, before I get fully into what I talked about in the book and sort of a brief overview so that we can discuss it, I do want to say, as Meredith said, what the sort of goal of the book was. So our Values in Capitalism series exists on college campuses all across the country, and the point of this book was to sort of be a sort of introductory volume or a primer for college students that also sort of makes an argument about improving the American education system. So I know, speaking here to, I think, a very keyed-in DC policy audience, I don't know if there are any of you that are freshmen or sophomores in colleges out there, but if not, you might not necessarily be the attending audience. So if you find it a little light, that's okay. But anyway, with that preface in mind, basically the argument of the book that I make proceeds in 5 pretty straightforward arguments that I want to make, and each one sort of builds on the previous one, right? So the first argument that I make in the book is that education is important, right? So this, I think, is a fundamental idea in a lot of education reform, and others is that we have to believe that education and improving education for students has the ability to improve their lives. If we don't, for some reason, if we think that there are societal factors outside of education or others that sort of permanently hold students back, then maybe we should expend our efforts elsewhere. We shouldn't necessarily focus on education. In what is sort of the first substantive chapter, the second chapter of the book, I try and compile a wealth of statistics and also argumentation from going as far back as our founding fathers about the importance of education. I don't want to go into all of them today, but I do want to highlight sort of two key important data points that I uncovered in my research that I think are worth sharing. And the first is from our friends over at the Brookings Institution. So Ron Haskins and other economists tracking economic mobility throughout the course of people's lives, and particularly looking at education, produced this graph here, which I found to be extremely informative. So basically what this does is it tracks individuals who were born into the poorest 20% of American society, so the bottom quintile of incomes in America, and tracks where they end up later in life. And if you look, the left side, which are the blue bars, are individuals who were born into that poorest quintile and did not go on to graduate from college. So those that did not graduate from college had a 45%, roughly, likelihood of remaining for the course of their lives in that bottom income quintile. And actually only a 5% likelihood of ending up in the highest income quintile. And you'll see that sort of descends. So the vast majority of likelihood is in that first and second column, which would say that you were born extremely poor and you remained extremely poor throughout the course of your life. Now, the sort of yellowish, greenish bars are for those students that were likewise born into the poorest 20% of society, but were able to successfully graduate from college. And if you look, the bar for the highest income quintile is actually taller than the bar for the lowest income quintile, which means even a person born into the poorest 20% of society, if they're able to successfully graduate from college, has a higher probability of ending up as one of the wealthiest Americans as opposed to one of the poorest. I think that's an important finding to highlight. The second piece uses data from our friends at Pew, who've tracked income related to education over an extended period of time. And what you see here, this is the median income of full-time workers. This is at people at the beginning of their career, so workers aged 25 to 32. And this is tracked from 1965 until 2013. Now, if you look, this is held in 2012 dollars, but back in 1965, the gap between the salaries of college-educated workers and high school educated workers was actually not that great. So your average or your median college-educated worker made about $38,000, $39,000 per year, and your average high school-educated worker made around $31,000 per year. But as we track that trend over time, we see two things happening. One, the value of solely a high school diploma has decreased. In 2013 dollars, it's now only worth about $28,000 in income per year. And the value of a college degree has actually increased substantially, up to about $45,500 per year. Now, in the book, I also break this down based on if we want to just look at high school versus non-high school completion. And again, we see generally the same pattern. As we have transitioned to a more information-driven economy, there are greater and greater returns to education. Okay? So, that's argument number one. Education is important. I don't think I've lost anyone yet, but it's possible. So let's go to the second part. My argument is that currently constituted, our education system is not getting it done. It's not setting up enough students on that path of opportunity and eventual prosperity. So again, I tried to collect a diverse set of statistics to make this case, of which I'm just going to highlight two right now. Again, there are more in the book. The first is actually a very simple sort of snapshot look at the National Assessment for Education Progress, which is a test that's been given to a representative sample since the 1970s. It was most recently given in 2013, and if we just look at this is the sort of the percentage of students that are rated proficient on this test, right? In fourth grade, we see, in fourth grade reading, 35% of students are found to be proficient in America. Fourth grade math, it's 42%. Eighth grade reading, it's 36%. Eighth grade math, it's 35%. So between a third and 4/5 of American students are actually hitting the sort of benchmarks that we have for grade level reading and mathematics, which I think is a troubling development. If you disaggregate this by race, or you look at or income, look particularly at urban areas, et cetera, you see even broader or even lower amounts. And the second one is, this is looking at sort of all students, but what if we look at actually our students, if we care about college completion, et cetera, what if we look at students that are actually applying to go to college? Well, every year, the ACT, and I'm a Midwesterner growing up, so I took the ACT, releases the results of its test. So this is for students who took the ACT. So this isn't all students, this is a selected subset who actually said, hey, I want to go to college, or at least try to go to college, let me take the ACT. What did they find? Only 26% of students who took the ACT scored college ready, as in, I believe their standard is something like the ability to get a passing grade in your entry-level courses at your first year of college. Only 26% scored college ready in all 4 subjects, right? So if we want our education system to do better, we believe that it has the power to do this, these are troubling statistics. So that's argument number 2, right? Hopefully I haven't lost anyone. Again, it's possible. I shall trudge on. Number 3. Now, part of this almost has to be axiomatically true, that if we're not getting the results that we want, what we are doing isn't working. But I want to take a little bit more in-depth look on that and make the argument that what we have tried to do to improve the American education system either hasn't worked or hasn't worked enough. I think it's probably a better statement to say that it hasn't worked enough as opposed to it hasn't worked. So some of these are some familiar, again, there's more of this in the actual book, but in the basic thing, we've talked about having more money. So we see, continual increased expenditure from the 1970s until today. This is, if anyone is even remotely interested in education policy debates, you're familiar with this graph from the Digest of Education Statistics. I think another one that's actually people are less familiar with, but I find fascinating, is some work by an economist from Georgia, Ben Scafidi, who tracked staffing patterns over a period of time. This is the percentage change in employees in the public school system in America from 1950 until today. If you look, we've seen about a 96% increase in the number of students in the United States from 1950 till today. We've actually seen a 386% increase in total school personnel. Now, if we disaggregate that 386 number between teachers and administrators and other staff, we've seen a 252% increase in the number of teachers and a 702% increase in administrators and other staff. Now, those of you that are familiar with education policy from 1950 to today might argue that much of this is driven by including students with disabilities, which we do so today at a rate far more than we did in 1950. Now, while that is true, Dr. Scafidi also looked at these numbers from 1992 until today and from 2000 until today. And while the numbers are somewhat attenuated, the pattern actually remains the same. We seem to continue to see large numbers of administrators and other staff greatly outpacing the increase in the number of students. There have also been a lot of other reforms to the system that at some place or another in large scale or small scale have been attempted. Smaller class sizes, universal preschool or preschool programs across the country, which is definitely something that's part of the policy agenda now. There have been inter-district choice programs. We're hearing a lot out of St. Louis right now, which is one of the most recent groups that tried this, busing students in between districts from low-performing districts to higher-performing districts. There's also been a big push of the standards and accountability movement, testing students, holding schools accountable, and now increasingly holding teachers accountable for student results. And ultimately, I think it's a difficult picture when you look at these types of reforms because two things I think are true. One is that in each of these cases, in isolated experiences or many across the country, with the example of standards and accountability, we have seen positive results associated with them. So I think careful analysis of things like No Child Left Behind and others, at least if you use student test scores as a sort of barometer of this, we've seen advances, particularly in mathematics and others, associated with some of these proposals. But at the same time, I think many of these advances have been made around the edges. Some of these programs, for example, like standards and accountability, I think are about as built out as they are ever going to be. And they have still not been able to crack that ultimate number that we're looking at of only a third of our students reading and doing math at grade level. So I tend to subscribe to a kind of alternative view, which I would say is in no way a Mike McShane original. And that is that actually the problem with the system is just that, the system, right? And to give credit where credit is due, I think one of the initial people that sort of offered this view, John Chubb and Terry Moe, in their landmark book back 25 years ago now, Politics, Markets, and America's School. My colleague here at AEI, Rick Hess, in Education Unbounded, and lots of other work that he's done. Actually, my fellow panelist, Andy Smerek, has made this argument as well, that the current way that we organize schools in the sort of bureaucratically driven vestige of the progressive era is just not well equipped to meet with the changing needs of students or to personalize or customize education in a way that's necessary to crack those numbers that matters. I think we generally have an education system from another age, and it's time we bring it to today and tomorrow. So, how do we do that? Argument number 4. My argument is that we've actually seen peaks at a better way. It's not to say that these experiments or work that has been done are in any way definitive, but to say that they've given us a lens of what we might be able to do to wholesale improve the American education system. And I argue, again, this is not necessarily a Mike McShane original, but that markets can be an extremely powerful tool for improving the education system and actually improving any number of systems across our economy and society. So what are some of the tools that we've seen that many of you are probably familiar with are things like charter schools, school vouchers, tuition tax credits, and I tend to not get as hung up on the individual mechanisms that we talk about, even though I would say that there are upsides and downsides each of them. I'm generally talking about the overall thrust of trying to separate out the operation of schools from direct government control, allowing more independent or autonomous organizations to actually be in the business of operating schools under government funding. So government funds it, independent people operate it, people are free to choose amongst them. I think it will allow for a more diverse set of approaches. It will allow people to better match with the schools that best fit their needs, and will promote things like competition and others for the best talent and for the best people. Now, this is where my book, I think, departs from a lot of the thinking that has existed to date on this topic, because I tend to think that many of my compatriots on the political right and people that are pro-school choice advocates oftentimes stop their argument right here. They're big believers in the invisible hand and say, look, the solution that we need, I spend a non-trivial amount of my time on right-wing talk radio, and I will tell you that it is shared by many people across this great nation of ours. Mike, the thing we need to do is just give everybody vouchers and everything will work itself out. Well, I don't really think it works like that. I don't think that it's enough to merely say we want to inject these market forces, or we want to, give everybody the ability to choose between their schools, and then somehow magically this is all going to work out. Now, what makes me think this? I want to make an analogy here, and I try to use this as sort of an overarching metaphor, a way to understand this. We're going to take a little trip right now. We're going to leave here in Washington, D.C., and we're actually going to go to this copper mine in Zambia. Stick with me here, y'all. It's like, oh boy, he just went off the deep end. No. So here's the argument that I want to make, right? About 70% of Zambia's economy is tied into the copper mining and the copper trade. For decades, 60s, 70s, and 80s, the copper industry functioned as a state-owned enterprise. So it was a government monopoly, right? They're the people who operated the mines. And for decades, even while copper prices increased and others, the mines lost money hand over fist. just take it out in the field and burn it. That's how poorly these mines did. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, communism around the world, there was a push in Eastern Europe, in Africa, Southeast Asia, Central America, South America, and even parts of Western Europe to privatize or to break up these state-owned enterprises and turn them over to private management. Right? And in most of these schemes, the citizens would then get the equivalent of something like a voucher that you would own stock in this newly created private enterprise. So in the mid-2000s, copper mining in Zambia was turned over to private control. About this time, I don't know how many of you follow local news, but this was that sort of epidemic of people stealing air conditioners. Remember that? People would steal air conditioners because they wanted to take the copper coiling out of it. Because at that time, almost coinciding with the privatization of Zambian copper mines, the price of copper shot up, tripled, quadrupled, I think, in a very short period of time. So now is Zambia the sort of copper version of the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain or Oman? No. Still one of the poorest countries in America and in Africa, which makes it one of the poorest countries in the world. And its copper mining system, while somewhat improved, is actually still kind of flailing. So what happened? Well, it turns out that those newly created private companies didn't have the machines to get the copper out of the ground. They didn't have the engineers to operate the machines or to figure out where they needed to go mining for the copper. Even once they got the copper, they didn't have the roads to take the copper to a port to then ship it around the world. I offer Zambia as a cautionary tale, though we can talk about places all around the world, that after the fall of communism, the fall of these big conglomerate state-owned enterprises, some people were more successful than others, right? Eastern Europe and Central Europe look a lot different than one another today. The Balkans and the Baltic look a lot different than they are today. Many of the problems that we're seeing in Russia can actually be traced back to the sort of failure to create marketplaces there, which created this sort of class of oligarchs that control all of the wealth that exists there. So markets are not magic, right? That's not how they work. Markets have to have a whole sort of mechanism around them to help them function. And that, to me, is what the end of my book is about, is what does it look like to actually create a marketplace and to create the forces around it that will actually generate new, better schools and help match families to these schools. And I borrowed, actually, from the literature of development economics, and actually a book that was published by the Council of Foreign Relations back in the 90s that argued that this sort of market creation type of stuff that I'm talking about is really a three-legged stool, right? And the three legs of the stool are liberalization, stabilization, and institution building, right? So if we look at each of these briefly, and again, I'm able to go in a bit more detail in the book, but I actually have gone into greater detail in some other writings that I do if you go onto AEI's website, where I've spoken about this in greater depth, which we can talk about. But we talk about liberalization. Liberalization is actually the act of injecting market forces into these sort of government systems. So we could call this school vouchers, charter schooling, et cetera. But it also talks about creating new and different ways. So two of the things that I highlight in the book are education savings accounts, which are basically like health savings account, like flexible use spending accounts that money would be put in for parents to spend on their child's education as they best see fit, to divide it amongst themselves. So if you want to pay for after-school tutoring, or if you want to pay for private school tuition, or if you want to pay for speech therapy or whatever, you're able to build from there. And the other things like course access programs that actually allow traditional public school students to break up the funding that they receive and spread it amongst different providers if they so choose. So for example, you love the high school that you're going to, but you'd rather learn Mandarin and they only offer Spanish and French. So you could take 1/7 or 1/8 of your funding, and for that class period, go and use an online provider or work with a private tutor or others, and your funding would be able to pay for that. So these are ways that we can inject these sort of forces into the system. But again, I tend to think that this is what we talk about always when we talk about school choice, right? We talk about liberalization, injecting market forces, and we give short shrift to the second two legs of the stool, and we do so at our peril. So the second part of the second leg of the stool is about stabilization. So one of the elements that a lot of sort of post-Soviet economies ran into was price stabilization. Because the government had set prices for basic goods, they ended up varying wildly as the market set them. I think we actually have a somewhat similar problem when we talk about education in America today. We have no idea how much it costs to educate a student, right? Now, we know how much we spend, but how much we spend on something and how much it actually costs are actually two different numbers, right? Because even under charter school or school voucher programs, money is given in this one sort of big lump sum. So charter school operator, you get your $8,000 per year. Private school, you get your $5,000 voucher. Those schools are sort of incentivized to spend that exact amount, because if not, you're leaving money on the table. There's no real point in doing that. And families are in no way sort of incentivized to say, well, is there a way that we could do this for less expense? Is that possible? Because they would be leaving money on the table as well. So having more flexible, so things like course access programs or education savings accounts actually start to take cost into the equation, and can promote a system that's not only more effective, but is also more efficient. The second one is also about the rule of law. You know, a lot of developing economies struggled with this as well, setting clear rules so that people have confidence to enter the market. There's a really interesting piece that I highly recommend in the Wall Street Journal from earlier this week, from the president of the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, which was called the Pharaoh Effect. I don't know if you all are familiar with the Pharaoh Effect, but it talked about a lot of religious organizations. And when we talk about a lot of these school choice programs, particularly private school choice programs, the bulk of the people that participate in them are religious schools. And he offered a sort of caution of religious organizations that then go and work with the government because, like Joseph and the Jews of Egypt, there may be a Pharaoh who knows not Joseph. The problem is that eventually when the government can start placing restrictions on private religious organizations that then they disagree with in the future. So setting clear rules if schools choose to participate in this program so that they can have expectations for how they'll be held accountable, what sort of interaction they will have in the government is also extremely important. Many school choice programs exist in this sort of flux that, depending on who gets elected or the whims of the bureaucrat that oversees them, they don't know if they're going to get shut down or if they're going to have vastly different things. That's going to prevent people from wanting to enter the marketplace. And the final one, which I think is actually the most important, is about institution building. If we want this marketplace to work, we need sort of three things. One is a regulatory structure that actually regulates a marketplace. You know, generally speaking, when we talk about standards and accountability or the current regulatory structure we have for public schools, that's sort of designed to regulate a monopoly. Right? It says you all are not free to choose between the schools that you have, so we're going to set central definitions of quality and hold schools accountable and teachers accountable for meeting them. You know, markets don't really work like that, right? Markets work more to try and develop, or regulations of markets try to work more to have basic, oh, am I dying there? Luckily, there's only one more slide, so we're good. Yeah, so basically they are designed to fit into allowing the market to be a check on people, but as well as holding sort of basic safeguards so that schools wouldn't harm children or steal the taxpayers' dollars. But we need a sort of new vision of that. Second is human capital. So I think it's also important to think that the people who might teach and particularly lead schools in this sort of new marketplace are probably different, or would be successful in that, may be different from the teachers and leaders that we have today. The principal might have to be as much more of a CEO working in marketing or legal compliance or accounting, et cetera, more so than they may have to do today. So there might be new streams that are needed for that. And then finally, financial capital, like the copper mines that need financial instruments to find the machines to get the copper out of the ground. If we want to start new and different schools, we have to figure out ways to have them get access to capital, to get buildings, to get computers, to get desks, et cetera, which we haven't necessarily done a great job of. Now, again, in the book, I give all sorts of examples of how to do this, but I wanted to give you the brief overview. So really, the book in a nutshell, and then I'll stop talking, is if you want to take it away in one phrase, is if you want to improve the American education system, and I think you should, and if you want to leverage markets to do so, which I also think that you should, there's a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me today. It's great to be here. And I was telling Mike beforehand, it's actually really difficult, I think, to write a good introductory book on an issue that's as complex as this, and to try and do justice to the complexity, but also provide some on-ramps for a new audience that's just coming into the conversation. And I think this book does a great job of doing this. And so my compliments to Mike for that. And I think it joins a great series, the Values in Capitalism Project. So everyone who's been involved with that, it attains to that standard that has been set by a lot of books that everyone here has been working on. So that's great as well. I'll give comments today from a couple of perspectives. One, until recently, as was mentioned in the introduction, I was working on policies with social mobility and opportunity in Britain, and social and school choice was one of the issues we were pushing there, although it's much more difficult a case to make there than it is here. But then more in particular, my work more recently with school choice in Georgia. So I will try to bring some of the concrete challenges from that context into conversation with the bigger issues that we're talking about here. And thinking about Georgia as, on the one hand, not a, say, Indiana or Florida when it comes to school choice, but still a reform-friendly state. And so I think it's a good example in terms of some of the challenges that we have there. So Mike covers a lot of important ground in his book, but if there is a key sentence that I were to select to sum up his main argument, it might be this, quote, "Fundamentally, school choice policy is about getting students into seats in high-quality schools." And I very much agree with that so far as it goes. In Georgia, thinking about the context there, we have three ways in which we're doing that. We have charter schools. We had to work very hard to get a constitutional amendment to get an independent authorizer, and so that set things back a little bit, but we have charter schools. We have a special needs scholarship, and we have a $58 million tax credit scholarship program. So those are our main menu items for school choice in Georgia. They're not without difficulties, again, having to work for some time to get the constitutional amendment to allow that independent authorizer has made it more difficult for some of the higher quality operators to come into Georgia until they've waited to see how things settle out. We have KIPP, but perhaps not as many of the others that we would like to see in time. And the tax credit scholarship program is the only program like it of any state in the U.S. that's not means tested. And so it has meant that it has struggled to win some of the broader support for expanding that other states might find an easier time of it because of that. And we just, it opened this year in January, and as you can imagine, with everybody competing for those funds, it went in 20 days. So in 20 days, $58 million cap was met. So that's the kind of unique context that we have there. So if the primary task is creating more seats in the best of charter and private schools, then I certainly agree that we need good ones to scale up, and we need to start new ones from scratch. And furthermore, as Mike lays out in the book, vouchers are not going to fund that. Vouchers are going to fund operations, but they're not going to allow us to do the kind of capital expansions that we need if high-quality schools are going to get buildings and do all kinds of things to increase what they're doing. I don't know if you mentioned it in your presentation, but in the book, Mike talks about social impact bonds, which I think is the kind of innovative thinking that we really need in this space. Some of my colleagues in London worked on one of the first social impact bond projects with Peterborough Prison. We are now in year 2 of that and beginning to see some promising results come from that, where government basically contracts to pay for social outcomes against the savings that they realize by successful work amongst nonprofits. And so I think that this education space is really ripe for that kind of thinking, and maybe that's something that we can talk about more in the question and answer time. I think one of my larger concerns, again thinking about the context on the ground in Georgia, more than capital investment, however, is the potential talent pool to resource the number of good schools that we need. Just the other day I was talking with a principal of a really high-performing school in Indianapolis, private Christian school, 50% or more are low income, and they're doing a fantastic job, and they're expanding, which is not common always amongst private schools. And so they're looking for buildings and looking for ways to expand. But talking to him, as challenging as finding the buildings and doing the capital piece, the perennial challenge, he will say, is finding the talent for those kinds of expansions. And so it's a slow process. And he was observing over the last year or so a high quality charter organization that was expanding, but expanded too quickly and had to close some schools. So it's a difficult, I think the talent question is a very big question. And I think that's true for what we've observed in Georgia. If we could remove hurdles to the expansion of choice tomorrow, I haven't necessarily observed the talent pipeline with the quality of leaders and teachers that we need. And it's not a pipeline that I anticipate being able to be filled on the level that we need it, certainly in the near future. My organization, Arete Scholars, is one of the tax credit scholarship organizations that enables low-income kids to attend a private school. And when I joined them a year ago, I visited some of our partner schools, somewhat naively thinking that in this oasis of freedom from regulation and government control that I would find innovation and entrepreneurialism and multiple different kinds of pedagogies and experiments with blended learning, and the list goes on. And for those of you that know this space, will not be surprised that I was disappointed largely in terms of what I found. There were some great exceptions, but by and large, I saw sort of faith-based reduplications of the kind of 19th century factory model that we could observe in nearly any school up and down the road. And so my optimism was quickly curtailed in that. On the basis of that, on the basis of those observations, we decided to commission an outside party to evaluate the gain scores of our students in our partner schools. We used our scholarship as leverage, and we said, if you want our scholarship money, you have to share the national test scores with us. And so they said, okay. And overwhelmingly, most of them used the Iowa test. And so when the national percentile ranking for our students in reading and math was calculated, they came in at the start as averaging slightly below the 50th percentile, which is pretty much on par with a comparable study that David Figlio did for the Florida voucher program. So that was as we expected. What we found, though, is that our students on average did not gain ground and actually lost ground by about 3 or 4 percentage points average between math and reading. Now, I add all kinds of caveats with that. It was a smaller sample size. This was not a statewide kind of study, although it was rigorous. And I suspect that the sample scores would go up if it were on a much broader scale in that respect. And of course, all of the other caveats that need to be made. Testing's not everything. There were all kinds of obvious forms of social capital being invested in the students beyond just the academics. The parents were incredibly happy when we surveyed our parents. The survey suggested that they were 95% of them were far happier with their students in those schools than in the schools that they left. Although I think many of the parents would have been surprised to know the low scores that were coming out. There is an assumption, I think, certainly in many of the parents that we're giving scholarships to, that if my child is in a private school, it's got to be good. If it's private, that automatically equals good. And I think there's work to be done in terms of educating parents and families in that respect. Now, of course, as Andy can talk about in much greater detail than I can, not surprisingly, what was hidden in those average scores was a huge amount of disparity from one school to another. So there were, in the midst of that, some very high-performing schools with our low-income kids on scholarship. But by and large, that bell curve was slightly weighted to the left, and there were far fewer high-performing schools than I would have liked to have seen in the sector that we were working with. So the small number that we're doing really well suggests, I think, that perhaps we don't have the broadly dispersed or available talent in private schools any more necessarily than we do have available in public or charter schools. Now, some would point to countries like Finland and say, well, we just need to work further upstream and invest in our teacher training programs. And I would simply say to that I think given the diversity and the size and the disbursement of America, that Finland's solution to that is probably not going to be our solution to that. So As much as I want to scale high-performing schools, my question is whether that is possible on a broad level, so long as schools are configured as they presently are. There are heroic examples of the kind of work that staff do at schools like KIPP. But my concern is that there are not enough people who can operate at that level over a long period of time. So my final point then is to wonder if those of us in school choice are perhaps too exclusively focused on expanding a particular kind of school model that is perhaps overly sector-based at precisely the time that society's broader notions of learning and education are changing very rapidly. Mike talked about education savings accounts, which they've now passed in Arizona. It's very early days with that, but it seems to me that unlike vouchers, which function to kind of keep the whole school model intact, ESAs potentially allow for the disaggregating of school as we've typically thought about it. Education becomes less about filtering knowledge to students through a carefully controlled portal and allows us to begin rethinking the whole enterprise about how we should be educating and learning today. So as most of us, as we all know here, the process of learning in the world outside of school is rapidly changing. Google is digitally archiving the world's reading materials. MIT is offering courses for free online. Citizen Schools in Boston is bringing in specialized outsiders to volunteer and teach courses after school. Tutor.com connects students 24 hours a day to someone who can help them potentially on the other side of the world. Teenagers can attend coding boot camps for 9 weeks and come out with a highly marketable set of skills. So I think the ways of learning are potentially outstripping the current school model that we have today. And perhaps we should think about schools looking less like a general handyman like they have historically and more like a general contractor in which they're bringing in all kinds of specializations. So I think it's important that in arguing for school choice, we remember that developing technologies and approaches like ESAs have the possibility of making perhaps some of the protracted battles of the past, if not obsolete, then perhaps a little less inflammatory, and may drive innovation and reform from below rather than from above, and invite even more diverse players into the market, and may allow for greater school choice than we were perhaps even considering before. So, thank you.
I hate going last after two really smart people. Everett Dirksen, I think he was a Illinois senator back in the day. He famously said that, let me get this right, U.S. Senate debates went on way too long because, yes, everything's been said, but not everyone has said it yet. And so I feel like I'm going to repeat what a lot of these guys have said so far. Forgive the computer up here. I'm going to quote Mike at length at times in good ways. I'm going to be a sycophant about 2/3 of the way through this, saying nothing but nice stuff about Mike's production, because it really is. And the last third, part of this is just going to be my projection onto him, something that I've been wrestling with that I hope that I can convince anyone here who considers themselves both an education reformer and a conservative that you ought to be wrestling with too, that I think some things are surfaced in this book. That's the most provocative part. I'll keep it for the last so I can keep you awake during the first 2/3. But I should begin by saying the book was wonderful. Really well written, compelling. If you haven't had the chance to go through it yet, I really recommend that you do. So the three things I want to highlight. The first thing is that, and Mike pointed this out, and he didn't give himself enough credit. The book has a sophisticated view of markets in a way that we just haven't had in K-12 for way too long. He has this understanding of the strengths of markets, but also their natural limitations. And let me quote something for you, because it really is the heart of the book. A vibrant marketplace of education options is the most effective means of developing the schools necessary to meet the needs of students today and in the years to come. And there are a couple pieces in here that you may gloss over, but they really make up, I think, the foundation of this book. The first is this idea of options. We take it for granted that not all kids are the same, not all schools are going to fit all kids the best, but the next step in that is how do we create the schools we need and how do we empower parents the way that we need. But the next step in this sentence and throughout the book is this joint idea. He uses the word vibrant before marketplace, which is essential. It connotes life, dynamism, and then he also uses the term developing schools, not just creating schools in time T1 and they exist in perpetuity. The idea here is that we are having an evolving, changing, continuously improving set of schools. And this is different than what we've had in the past. It is not get it right today and then just micromanage. It is that the world is going to change in year 1 and year 5 and year 10, and we need a system that can evolve, can adapt to all of those things. And he gets that right through this language. For those of you who follow chartering, the analog here is the genius of whoever first thought of emphasizing that charter should be seen as a verb, not as an adjective. Yes, we can talk about a charter school, but that's static. It describes a school. It modifies a network of schools. But to think of charter as a verb, to charter, means to create, to hold accountable, to close when it fails, to replicate and expand when it's good. Year 2, to create, to hold accountable. It's a continuous improvement cycle. And Mike's view on this, that it's not just choice, that it is the this continuous improvement, for lack of a better term, the creative destruction language of churn is embedded in here, and I think that's really important. He also makes it clear that it is the market's job to make sure that these things actually take place. In his words, markets don't present solutions to problems, rather they create the conditions under which innovative thinkers can solve problems. And this is different than what we've heard in the past. This is about establishing rules, setting up incentives, and encouraging the right type of behavior. Mike smartly put up on their Education Unbound, a book by his colleague Rick Hess, who really uses this wonderful term, greenfield schooling, for a different way of thinking about systemic reform, which is, it's not about planting all the trees yourself and doing this very scientific, organic, lining up the trees the way you want to. It's creating the fertile field so a bunch of different things can seed and catch root and build an ecosystem of its own. And that really is built into here in a way that I think is important. But the book discusses these kinds of activities, and he talked about them: stabilization, institution creation, and liberalization, smartly, but he does it with the requisite amount of humility. And this, again, has been totally missing, in my view, from the conservative choice-based sense of how to do education reform. In his language, markets are not magical. These things do not happen on their own. We have to tend to them consciously. And this is not just theoretical. In the most exciting, the most important places where K-12 reform in urban areas has taken off, Washington, D.C., Detroit, we're on the cusp of it, certainly New Orleans, Indianapolis, maybe Denver, potentially Kansas City, potentially Camden. It is these issues, because there are already choices there. Parents have options. There are educational entrepreneurs. The big challenge in these places actually tends to be, how do we create this system that makes use of this, that harnesses this, that actually creates a system that makes all of this make sense, make it coherent in a way that it currently is not. And so I don't want to put words into his mouth, but as I'm reading the book, what I'm getting is, what I wrote down is, wow, how do we develop the right policy and civil society environment so this choice-based system can actually work? And a lot of people who are writing about ed reform right now in urban areas are talking about ecosystem, and Mike, I don't think uses that word, but I think that's really at the heart of this first point I want to make, that he articulates this vision of smart markets in a way that is literally 25 years more advanced than choice is a panacea, which many of us were motivated by for way too long, thanks to Chubb and Mo, which I'll get to in a second. The second point that is great in the book is how he calls out this predominantly unitary system of delivering K-12 education that has been with us for about 100 years. One of my heroes, a guy named Ted Koldery, who, if you haven't read his stuff, you really ought to, he referred to the district as the exclusive territorial franchise. Exclusive territorial franchise. The idea that this government entity has the right to own and operate all public schools within a geographic area. Now, obviously, this sets up all kinds of problems. It's a monopoly by definition, with all the problems of monopolies. It's also going to not give very many options if it decides it doesn't want to give options at all. But there's something even more important that Mike points out in here that I think is little appreciated, and that's the idea that a unitary system, paradoxically somehow, proves to be infinitely divisive in ways that we may not have expected. In his language, quote, "The monolithic nature of education systems has created an adversarial environment wherein people of differing values are forced to fight for ideological supremacy." This is right. Many of us think of the common school movement of the 1830s, 40s, 50s, in like this, what do they call it, hagiography. We have this glossy, gauzy view of how beautiful it is, egalitarianism, spawning democracy, and so forth. That's the most sanguine view of it. But when there is just one system, you have to realize that there are going to be pitched, heated battles about who gets to control that system and what they want and what the other people don't get. In this famous book that Mike also put up there, Politics, Markets, and America's Schools, Chubb and Moe make this great argument against democratic control of schools. Their case is that it is easily captured when you have elections through school boards by vested interests who, to put it diplomatically, don't always have the best interest of kids' academic achievement at heart. A corollary of that Mike is really getting to in this book is that when you have disenfranchised groups, they are the ones who don't have political power, therefore they don't get to control what the system, the meaning unitary system, actually looks like. And this isn't just, again, some philosophical matter. This goes all the way back to 100 years ago. And if you have not read these two books, again, do yourself a favor. David Tyak's The One Best System, I think it's probably 40 years old right now, and it might be, I don't know, heretical to name Diane Ravitch here, but her amazing book, The Great School Wars, about the creation of the New York City public school system, again, this might be 40 years old, are really instructive on this front. Both of them detail the fights that had to take place to create the system that we have. Waves of immigrants were coming into this country in urban areas about 100 years ago, and they wanted to control their schools. They wanted their culture, their traditions, often their languages taught in their neighborhood schools. It was the folks who had been here before, who had all of the power, then into the progressive era, who decided, yeah, that's not right. That would balkanize this country. We need to Americanize these kids. In the best of cases, this is homogenization. In the worst of cases, this is downright divisiveness. It is an insult. It actually is hostile towards these new Americans. And if you think I'm going too far on this, if some of you aren't like sort of steeped in the history of ed reform, there's a famous Supreme Court case from 1925, Pierce versus Society of Sisters. Raise your hand if you've not heard of this. I just want to make sure I'm not, oh, great. All right. It was actually the case that state legislators and even members of Congress were so adamantly opposed to the idea of educational diversity that they tried to ban not even diversity just within public schools, they tried to ban private education, making it illegal to send your kids to non-government run schools. Now, the Supreme Court thankfully overturned all of these state laws in Wisconsin and other places, saying in this beautiful decision, children are more than the mere creatures of the state. But what this just goes to show is that the pedigree of this fight over the diversity, the importance of the diversity of education options within K-12 goes back very far, it's divisive, and I think Mike points out rightfully, contra Amy Gutman and a bunch of other people, I think he and I would both argue that the more you do to advance educational diversity, actually the more you do to advance the cause of democratic pluralism. You don't undercut it, you actually do more in that case. There's great literature actually on the civic behavior of kids who go to choice schools that is really compelling. Let me just get to my third point here, and this is the provocative one, and this is the more philosophical one and the one where Mike might get mad at me. So it seems to me that if Edmund Burke, the wonderful British politician and theorist, if he were around today, one of the fathers of a particular strand of conservatism, if he were around today, he might not like this book all that much. He might view it skeptically. Many in this room, myself included, are drawn to Mike's and the conservatives' view of choice, of competition, of markets, of entrepreneurialism, of innovation. But we have to realize, and this is a part of Mike's book, that none of those things were baked into our system of public education at the beginning. They're of recent vintage at best. They are not part of the DNA of the system that we've had it. The problem here is, though, if you have this Burkean bent like I do, if you believe in the virtues of preservation, you may raise an eyebrow while reading parts of Mike's book. That is, if you believe that an institution or a practice sustains itself for a long time, meaning it is evolutionarily robust, it is that way for a reason. It is not just coincidence. There is something that has sustained it that's important. It has survived the test of time. Meaning it has all kinds of virtues that are both manifest and latent, and in many cases it is so tightly woven into the fabric of civil society that you don't know the damage you're doing until it's gone, until it's already too late. So what I'm getting at is the book's faith in innovation and change might strike some of you Burkean conservatives, preservation conservatives, as a bit too technocratic. Maybe it's the case that our current system, even though it has all of these flaws, maybe it has virtues that we are underselling. Maybe there is something to the idea of democratically elected school boards. Maybe there is actually something to a teacher giving direct instruction to 25 young faces as opposed to technology. Maybe there's something to be said for telling kids where to go to school based on their home addresses. There's this wonderful saying, I think it's called, there's a term for it, but the saying goes, one should never take down a fence until one is certain why it was put up. Never take down a fence until you're certain why it was put up. The gist here is if it's been there for a long time and stood the test of time, there might be something to it. There is some wisdom to be found in age and in experience. And so if you find any of the things I just said somewhere between compelling and interesting, let me point some things out that Mike says in his book that might make you think differently. Mike says, for example, quote, "To liberalize, school districts must essentially dissolve." Maybe that goes a little bit too far if you believe in preservation. He references this great scholar, Steve Tellis, his concept of kludgeocracy, which you should read if you haven't, which is anti-complication. But if you've read the book Seeing Like a State, you know that often conservatives like complications if it reflects the accumulation of wisdom over time. Michael also writes, quote, "New school programs and their attending regulations should not be added to existing systems, they should replace them." Again, you might wonder, is it more prudent, is it more evolutionarily sound to add, to adjust, rather than change wholesale? And lastly, when he talks about the downsides of democratic control of schools, you might say, well, democratic control isn't always great, but it has a tendency to be incremental, has a tendency to be modest, whereas when you put technocrats in charge and courts in charge, they have a tendency to be sweeping. So I have to do a concession here because I know Mike will call me out on it otherwise. I am the worst person in the world to give this this third set of arguments because I have sort of made my name saying we need to get rid of urban school districts and fundamentally change state departments of education and all kinds of other rash, sort of crazy reform-oriented things. It just strikes me, though, it is high time that we have a conversation, a meaningful one, about which aspects of K-12 education need to be reformed and what we have never done, to my knowledge, which aspects need to be jealously protected, which things need to be preserved, need to be walled off from all of these crazy technocratic anti-Smerek style reformers. And if you think, again, I'm just making hay about all this stuff, consider Common Core, common assessments, tenure, seniority, choice, charters. All of these things, when boiled down, they get to the question of, do we protect a system that we have had in place for a very long time, or do we have a brave new world of these new technocratic ideas that are going to be able to subsume and do better? At very least, Mike's book does the perfect job of surfacing these things, and at best, I hope it convinces all of us that we need to dig in and try to solve some of these tangles. Thank you.
That's great. Maybe before we throw it open, I'd love to respond. First off, thank you both very much for your kind comments. I think maybe we'll pick up with the end, because I think Andy, and I know some of the writing you've been doing recently has surfaced these ideas, and I'll admit that probably like you, they're still kind of percolating in my head and thinking through. And one of the things that I think back of when we talk about sort of like a Burkean conservatism or others, I think back to something I highly recommend everyone to read, which is Whittaker Chambers. I think 1959 or so, in National Review, wrote a review of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, which permanently sort of fractured like William F. Buckley from Ayn Rand and others in this big thing. But basically, the criticism that he made of libertarianism and of Ayn Rand and others is that he said you make the same mistakes that Marx did, which said that basically there are just individuals and there is the state. And so it's sort of like if you're a libertarian, you think it's like, if we imagine those sort of spheres, it's like the individual should have an enormous sphere and the state should have a little tiny sphere. And if you're a communist, you think the state should have this enormous sphere and the individual should have a little tiny sphere. And what sort of a Burkean conservative would argue is that there's actually a third sphere. And perhaps that most of our effort should be put in that, which is the civil society, which is exactly what you brought up, which is good. And so for me, when I think of education reform or when I think of these part of it is overturning some of the apple cart and breaking up these systems, but I think part of it is also trying to tap into these deep, long-held wealths of resources that are in the civil society, in religious organizations, in nonprofit organizations, and others that are out there, and trying to leverage those to improve schooling. So, I mean, I guess I definitely, I mean, I'm with you that in many ways, sort of my vision of a lot of this churn and things would break down some of these things that we have. You know, it's essentially incompatible with saying we're going to assign kids to go to schools where they live. Like my vision and those cannot work together. Like that can't. But there may be other facets of this. For example, let's take a thing like teacher tenure or teachers unions or any of those things. Conceivably, I think in this system there is opportunity for unionized schools, or schools that have tenure, or schools that use some sort of democratically controlled governance structure, and students would be free to choose them. And I think ultimately that many of the people who advocate for things like tenure, last in, first out, or unionization or others, I think they offer essentially like a testable hypothesis, which is that these policies that we advocate for are good for students. They may be right. So what I think is, let's give people the ability to choose them, or to choose something else if they don't like it. And then over time we might see like, hey, wait a second, turns out that all these schools that have tenure are really doing a great job. They're breaking these sort of talent problems that you're talking about, because it's a powerful recruiting tool. Dynamite, that's great, totally cool, I have no problem with that. But it's talking about, you know, sort of leveraging how do we sort people amongst those options based on free choices between them, as opposed to sort of a centrally managed one. I guess that would be my first, and like I said, I have more thinking to do on that as well. But you know, I think the other thing that's important to bring up that you brought up as well, Jeff, is that, you know, this human capital problem we have spent so much time talking about in the on the sort of public school, traditional public school side. I think the problem that plagues that debate is the same one that often plagues what we talk about. We focus so much on the bad. Like, we need, in school choice sides, like, we need to close these bad schools. And on the teaching side, we need to fire these bad teachers. It's like, it turns out that's actually not super helpful for kids. If you can close that bad school and then place that child in a school that's better, then that's good, but that's a big if. Same thing, like if you can move that child out of a school out of the classroom of a poor performing teacher, if you can't put them in another classroom with a higher performing teacher, you've just sort of shuffled around deck chairs on the Titanic. It's not really something to do. So I would hope that this would spur, both on the teacher quality side and others, the sort of flipping of that conversation, which is like, how do we create more new, better schools, and how do we cultivate more new, better teachers, better leaders, etc. So I hope that ultimately, even though I ended with kind of doom and gloom in my presentation, there's a lot of work to do, I hope that ultimately this is a more positive vision and a more optimistic vision that says that, yeah, these problems do exist, but we have ways to get out of them if we're willing to do the work to get there. So those would be my 2 cents.
If I can just respond briefly to this. Let me reason in 2 ways totally unrelated to education, then bring it back to education to just give you a clear sense of exactly what I'm worried about. When I was a young Hill staffer, I was working for a member who was on the Water Resources Committee, and I got a lot of lectures from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And they explained to me and made me read a bunch of books about how 100, 150, 200 years ago, the Corps of Engineers were actually the ones who were trying to stop the reform-minded people of the time from getting rid of what was ungently at the time called swampland. That it just seemed like a blight. It just seemed ugly. People wanted to get rid of it, build roads, make transportation and living so much easier. The Corps of Engineers was saying, slow down. We don't totally understand everything about this ugly swampland. Well, if any of you follow environmental policy or hydrology, you know that this ugly swampland that they got rid of actually turned out to be extraordinarily valuable. It stopped flooding. It incubated wildlife. It turned out to be the best habitat around. So reformers who thought they were getting rid of something messy were actually undermining a much bigger system. Fast forward 100, 150 years ago, when reformers in Chicago thought that the low quality housing in some of the worst neighborhoods was just the blight of all blights. They would get rid of it, and they would build the most beautiful high-rise public housing institutions, like the wonderful Cabrini Green, and so forth.
Bruinego in St. Louis, yeah.
Yeah, so if any of you aren't familiar with how the story ends, Cabrini Green and these other Chicago, they turn out to be the story of the worst technocracy ever. You knock down these old houses, old communities, you rupture social capital, you rupture norms that you didn't even realize were there, and you end up creating these systems where kids are getting killed by the dozens every day, open-air drug markets. You knock down something that was old, not realizing how beautiful it was, and you create something much more dangerous. Fast forward to education. A recent book just came out from two professors at Notre Dame called Lost Classrooms, Lost Community, where they for the first time empiricized what a lot of us have hypothesized about. They have found now, using data from Chicago, coincidentally enough, and some other places, that when you shut down Catholic schools that have been in a community for a long time, in some cases a century, yes, maybe 100 high-quality seats disappear. The technocrat would say that's all, we can create new schools. It turns out that those schools are so deeply woven into the communities, their fabric, that they can actually now statistically significantly show when you get rid of these Catholic schools that have been in the community for a long time, all types of social dysfunction end up bubbling up, including increased crime rates, increased drug use, other types of dysfunction in a community. Again, you get rid of something that is ugly, that is old, and you don't realize the damage it has done. And this is the shadow hanging over me, and hopefully those of us who want to reform. I'm saying tenure is no good, seniority is no good, these old districts are no good. And the voice in the back of my head is, are you trying to get rid of swamps? Are you trying to get rid of these ugly neighborhoods? Are you trying to get rid of Catholic schools? Is that the analog here? I'm not saying stop, I'm just saying hit the pause button. What have we wrought is what I'm going to ask myself 20 years from now.
Just to add 2 cents to Andy's really interesting question about the Burkean approach to this, because I think Burke would not want to answer that sort of question in the abstract. Burke was very much about paying attention to the particulars. And so perhaps the question in that is not in the abstract, what might we be missing, but what are the particular kinds of things on the ground that we would suggest perhaps this needs to stay. So it needs to almost start from a more granular particular kind of proposal than a more abstract question about that. And then I think Burke would presume that anything that happens, that change that happens in a positive way is going to be organic, it's going to be evolutionary. But it starts from those particulars.
Well, and there's something to be said for that. I'm sorry for dominating, and I did not mean to turn this into a debating society of 19th century philosophers. Honest to goodness. But if you look at recent survey data on a bunch of education reforms that have come down the pike, it is these new vaunted fancy Common Core teacher evaluation stuff that is, I keep using the term technocratic. We experts have figured this out and we are going to put it on top of you. Those are the ones that are getting the rebellion more than anything else. It's chartering, which slowly but surely, at first in the 1990s in Minnesota, then in California, slowly built market share, did course corrections, changing along the way, figuring out how to get things right. Now that it's 20, 25 years old, if you look at the public opinion on charter schools, it's sometimes double and a half the popularity in some places of some of these new reforms. If you go slow and steady and do this course correction, that might be better than big and brash. I promise no more Burke.
Yeah, cool. Well, I think we should can we turn it open to the crowd? I think we have people with microphones who might be.
Yeah, let's take some questions. As is with common AEI House rules, keep your questions brief and pithy and frame all protests in the form of a question. So
Yes.
Please wait until Tyler or Dana gets to you.
How did you get to be this big of an idiot? I guess that is a question that is technically phrased in the form of a question.
Not at all. Right in front here.
Yes, ma'am.
This has been very interesting for me. I'm Mitzi Wertheim. I'm a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School. You might wonder why I'm here, because I'm interested in how people learn and what kind of structures do we have that enable it. I want to make one statement about closing schools or giving people choice. I live in a community where we had multiple choices, but I couldn't figure out the transportation. And I think you're thinking in a world where we didn't have mothers that worked, that they could in fact take the kids around. So unless you get the geography into your argument, I think you're missing a very important point. I think the important point for me is having school systems that keep up with the changes that are going on. I'm acquainted with a very prominent academic institution here that has tenure, and they're still teaching in a course I created 30 years ago what they learned in graduate school in the 60s in international relations. Let me tell you, that world has changed a lot.
Little different today.
Yeah, right. The final thing I would say is I think where you're all handicapped on this is our educational system is not holistic. You become an expert on my necklace or on my watch, but you don't think about the fact that I'm wearing it or that I'm in this room. I think this is a problem we have across the board. There's not a single problem we have in our country that a particular department can solve. It is all interdisciplinary. Our educational system is not interdisciplinary. It doesn't talk about the other things that are needed in order to solve this problem, such as a transportation system if you want to move to a different school.
Yeah. No, I think that's an important point, and so I would have two responses to it. So the first one, I think, is a point well taken, talking about transportation and others. In many ways, if this book talks about the education marketplace, we think marketplaces have supply and demand, in the sort of classic equations that we think about in this one. This book is a lot about the supply side, so creating new and better schools, whatever. I think the concern that you bring up, which is a fair one, is, so what about the demand side? So how do we empower people with the best information that they can about the choices that are available to them? How do we make it possible for them to actually access these schools? How do they have the transportation networks, et cetera, child care, whatever might be necessary in order to make that happen? And that's true. I would say a lot of people have done really interesting work on a lot of those demand side questions. There are people who, that is true. They have not solved it, and I hope they keep working on it. But then I guess the second piece of it that I think is important too is talking about sort of a holistic look at this. I think part of that is in a reaction to a complaint that Andy has that I certainly share, which is when we develop these more monolithic systems that are technocratically managed, they might be good at solving isolated problems, but they're not necessarily good at looking at problems holistically. Because we have to use, when we have sort of one education system in the state of California or in the state of Missouri or something, we generally think of like this one system to oversee the same set of standards. Everyone's going to take the same tests. We're going to hold these things. So we have to use these really blunt instruments that sort of narrow what we're able to look at. I would like to think that my more decentralized system that leverages the civil society is able to take a more holistic look at education and sort of social problems writ large. Because, well, I can tell you, so I got my start teaching. I taught at St. Jude Educational Institute on the west side of Montgomery, Alabama, which was founded as a mission to the African-American community in the 1940s. And when the group of Passionist Priests, it was a Catholic organization, founded it, they decided to not only start a school, but because of the segregated times, African-American folks didn't have access to good hospital care. So they were able to start a hospital there too. There's an adult literacy center. There was a school for students with profound special needs. Because they leveraged the civil society, which is a religious organization which was able to raise money all across the country, that had a holistic look at the problems, they were able to really make an impact on the community of Montgomery, Alabama. It, in fact, was the campground, the last campground on the march from Selma to Montgomery. Dr. King played a large role there, and others. So what I'm trying to say is that my system, I tend to think that my ideal system that leverages the civil society, that decentralizes, actually does a better job looking more holistically. The more we centralize, the more we sort of technocratically try to manage, the more we isolate the particular problems, we develop individual kludges to try and solve them, and we're not able to do that. But thank you for your question. Go over here somewhere.
You're right here? Oh, wait for the microphone real quick. Thanks.
I was wondering if Mr. Bailey could expand a little more on what social impact bonds are, and if the other two panelists could talk more about exactly where Mr. McShane's book deviates from traditional conservative viewpoints on education reform.
Cool.
So the first social impact bond happened in England around prisoner reentry and prisoner recidivism. So prisons cost a lot. It costs a lot of money to put people in prison. And what you had is nonprofits who were doing some good work at helping people reenter society, get jobs, get housing, and not go back into prison. But most of them were small and not able to scale to the large enough degree to actually deal with the huge number of prisoners that were coming out. And so essentially social impact bonds, a intermediary group, functions to go and attract investors who will pay for certain outcomes, be it in prisoner reentry or anything else that has a measurable social cost. And the government, to the degree that it agrees with how much it's going to cost us down the way to put people into prison, if we can save those costs by, for a fraction of that spend, invest that into those groups that are able to help people reenter society, we have paid a certain amount up front, but we have saved a massive amount in the long run. And so we are now 2 years into that. The first year they had an 8% reduction in prisoners who were re-entering into society, not going into prison in comparison with the control group. This year they're at 15%. That's enough at that 10% mark to actually start paying back investors. And I think that this is a wide open possibility for schools as well, particularly because you've got models that actually have demonstrated success, and so it's not a shot in the dark.
Yeah, and I made the connection to education here, actually citing some of these same experiences. There's actually a really innovative program happening in Rikers Island in New York right now, funded by an investment from Goldman Sachs, actually, prison recidivism. And my argument with education is that actually, like, a lot of economists for decades now have estimated the effect of a lack of education on a variety of sort of social indicators. So if you don't graduate from high school, you're more likely to commit a crime or be a victim of a crime. You're more likely to end up on public assistance. You make less money, you pay less in taxes, all of these sorts of things that you might associate for a variety of reasons. And so, my argument was sort of like, if we have a pretty firm grasp on, like, we say, look, the social plus individual benefits, and we'd have to kind of work these things out of a high school diploma, could be in the neighborhood of like 500 grand. Right? So my thought is like, hey, look, if this is the amount of money, maybe to the public is only about 100 grand or something like that. If we can say to a school that needs that financial capital to start, et cetera, look, we see this more as an investment in the future, and we might incentivize for every student that you prevent from dropping out. If we expect 60% of students or 40% of students to drop out, for every student that doesn't drop out, you get a financial incentive for doing that, or working on a variety of other indicators. That may be a way to help these schools access capital in a way that doesn't necessarily leave the taxpayer on the hook if the school doesn't succeed. That was the kind of whole point of social impact bonds, is to privatize the risk. Because right now, every social program that we have, the public foots the bill and assumes the risk. So we don't have a problem. Look, I'm all for paying for programs that work. But when we pay for programs that don't work, we're all left on the hook for it. Whereas a social impact bond says, hey, if the program works, we pay for it. If it doesn't, somebody else has to foot the bill. And they're compensated for taking that risk. Then your second question of how it deviates from conservatism. Andy, you might be better at answering that one. I've always thought, I don't know, I'm weird and kind of find myself intersecting with other thinkers and sometimes disagreeing from them. So I don't know if you could put that in a better context.
Well, the two things that I think of first are, he's giving voice, an academic voice, explaining this developing system of ecosystem development, of what it means when you have a unitary, when the state is providing all schools, say pre-1990 in all big cities. In today, that has shrunk down in some places to 80%, 70, 60, 50% Washington, D.C., 10% in New Orleans. When the government no longer is controlling so much stuff, something has to fill the void. And this is the ecosystem of nonprofits that do human capital and facilities and transportation. They're providing, for lack of a better term, the connective tissue of the system. And when Mike is talking about the system development and what it actually means to, like, just say that markets aren't enough, markets aren't magical, that you actually have to tend to the third of his three things. It's institution creation or institution building, that he is advancing the thinking on that. The second part is, and I don't want to speak for him, but I think, oh God, I hope this isn't too provocative. I think Mike and I are just young enough that we are I'll say it for myself. I'm just young enough that I was not scarred by the initial school choice fights. I wasn't even in high school yet when the first Milwaukee battle was happening, when it was passed. I came of age post that, so all of my tendencies told me to like school choice, and I believed in competition, and I believed in markets and so forth. But I was also coming of age at the same time that we were learning the lessons of chartering. And so I think of my views, and I would like to think of Mike's views, as school choice 2.0. We are down with choice and competition and innovation and so forth, but we view it through a different lens, less the ideology. And I'm not saying this in a pejorative way. The people who advocated for it in the late 80s, early 90s, they only had ideology because there weren't examples of school choice programs. We now have examples of them, and we have millions of kids in charters. And so the way that we are thinking about markets is more about, okay, if choice is not a panacea, like Chubb and Mo said, how do we get accountability right? How do we get the supply of schools right? Like Mike writes in the book, choice programs have been great at populating existing schools and have been lousy at getting existing schools to expand or the creation of new schools. We are thinking in those terms and trying to say choice is awesome, it is necessary, but it is not sufficient. And I think in this short volume, he starts to give voice to that. Is that fair?
Great. Sir,
You
right,
have time for one more, you
yeah,
think? One more?
sir, right here in the red tie, Dana? Right, Dana, or right here.
Mike, with regard to your three-legged stool, don't you kind of think the devil is in the details about how those legs get constructed, particularly the last two? You talk about the need for the rule of law and regulation of the market. At some point, there are going to be very serious issues about what we're going to regulate or enact law on and how much of that we're going to do, particularly in areas like curriculum, assessment, and who gets to teach. Let's assume we won't regulate very heavily on the length of the school day and year, as we haven't really with charter schools. We probably will regulate on financial accountability. But those other things, to me, lead to the same mess that Andy was talking about that occurred with the public schools 100 years ago, 50 years ago, and over again, but maybe somebody else doing it. Maybe not. Maybe the state education agency, or a little scarier, the state legislature. And maybe ending up with, and you know, we never put the wisest dozen people in the room and have them come up with the best idea. A democracy is much messier than that. And are you confident that whoever gets to do it comes up with a much better system with regard to what's regulated and how?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I would have sort of two responses, because one is that, you know, when we talk about charter schooling, and we're actually here at AEI working on a research paper about this as we speak. If you actually go in and dig into a lot of charter school requirements now, a lot of authorizing documents from around the country, they're becoming increasingly prescriptive of what schools look like. And it varies from place to place and in others, and depending on, I think, who's doing the authorizing. But I think chartering can also be a cautionary tale of sort of the bureaucratization of marketplaces. And I think that sort of leads to my second point, which is, you know, part of my whole kind of markets are magic thing was the time that I spent writing this book, and in other things that I've done, really trying to study market creation from around the world. And when the Iron Curtain falls, or when the sort of Eastern European countries started, there's been a lot of debate. There was a lot of debate at the time. Sort of Poland had this like big bang, like let's do everything all at once and try and create these institutions. Others tried a more gradual approach. And I think that while it's not necessarily settled in their literature, though I'm not an expert on it, I mean, it was key to know that you can't just pull one thread and go with it. So there has to be some question of timelines, but you fall into like chicken and the egg problems. Well, we're not going to open these schools until we have the teachers to teach in them. Well, a teacher preparation program isn't going to prepare the teachers unless there are schools for them to go to. So we continue to kind of fall in this pattern. So part of it, I think, is when we look at it as an ecosystem rather than a system, when we look at it as, to borrow from Hayek, like as gardeners and not engineers, we have the ability to say, okay, there's a lot going on here. You know, like there's sunlight, there's rainwater, there's soil, you know, salinity, whatever, any of these things that we're working with. And we need to be thinking about all of them all at once from a step back perspective. And I'm optimistic that if the people that are operating these systems at the state level governors, state legislators, others look at it in that way and say, we respect the complexity of this system. We understand that a lot of parts are moving at once, and we understand that when we move one piece, it's going to affect all of the other ones. I think that increases the likelihood that they'll ultimately be successful. One of the problems that I think we've had with education reform on a variety of different topics is we've looked for that one lever that if we just pull that, that's going to solve the problems, or that's kind of the big lever that we need to push on. And we haven't had enough respect for saying, well, when you change one part of an extremely complex system, it radiates out to everything else. So I'm optimistic, but I'm also young. It may change as I age and grow into a surly old man. But I hope I keep my optimism. Okay, thank you all for coming.
Many thanks to our panelists. Jeff, thanks so much for coming all the way from Atlanta. Thank you, Andy and Mike. Thank you all for joining us today. If you haven't already grabbed a copy of Mike's book, please do so on the way out. For more information about values and capitalism, you can find us at valuesandancapitalism.com. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.